Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. So I wanted to tell a little bit of a history, paint the story of Hanukkah in America. And as we'll soon see, the contemporary celebration of Hanukkah by American Jews all over the world is something that would have been unrecognizable to Jews 300 years ago across the Jewish world. Just a couple of statistics. According to latest Pew polling, about 85% of Jews in America celebrate Hanukkah in some capacity, whether that means lighting the candles or having some sort of festive Hanukkah meal, buying Hanukkah presents, and the like. That is a massive percentage. I'm pretty sure the next biggest is either high holidays or Passover. That's probably hanging around, 60%, 70%. And so Hanukkah has sort of become the epitome of the American Jewish experience. And so I wanted to just discuss this a little bit, trace how we came to this, and paint a lot of the different pictures between the sort of quote unquote real story of Hanukkah and the contemporary Americanification of Hanukkah. And I want to start off with Doug Emhoff. For those familiar with the name, Doug Emhoff, of course, is Kamala Harris's husband. He is the first gentleman of the vice president. I'm forgetting, I'm sure there's some fancier term to say that. And Doug Emhoff, of course, is Jewish. And this is what Doug Emhoff tweeted exactly 1 year ago during Hanukkah in 2023. And so now I am quoting. The story of Hanukkah and the story of the Jewish people has always been one of hope and resilience. In the Hanukkah story, the Jewish people were forced into hiding. No one thought they would survive or that the few drops of oil they had would last. During those 8 days in hiding, they recited their prayers and continued their traditions. That's why Hanukkah means dedication. It was during those dark days that the Maccabees dedicated themselves to maintaining hope and faith in the oil, each other, and their Judaism. End quote. Doug Emhoff, of course, immediately received pushback, and I'll explain why. He eventually deleted this tweet. And I don't mean to pick specifically on Doug Emhoff. I'm guessing that there's a massive number of American Jews that think that Hanukkah waters down to some sort of, this is a beautiful holiday of maintaining hope and faith and light and all this sort of, universalism that American Hanukkah has been. And this is, of course, completely different than the actual historic Hanukkah. And so let's just take a step back. The actual story of Hanukkah, the Maccabees, 2nd century BCE. This is after the Greek Empire and Alexander the Great conquered their way across the Middle East. In the next 150 years, it was a process of Hellenization that took place within the entire Greek world, and many Jews were becoming infatuated with the Greek cultural experience. Hey, who doesn't love a nice bathhouse and amphitheater? And theater seems a lot more exciting than studying Jewish texts in the Beit Midrash all day. And at the same time, the Greek Empire was sort of encroaching onto Jewish practice. The Greeks wanted to have anybody in the Greek Empire practice their pagan-like religions, to the point where in the year 163, King Antiochus eventually pushes to the point where he puts an idol in the sacred temple in Jerusalem. Now, it's not necessarily the case that all Jews were against this. Some Jews who were overly assimilated into Greek culture might have welcomed the Greek influence into Judaism, but the Maccabees ended up killing one of the first people to offer a sacrifice to this idol, and then ended up fleeing to the hills and engaging in guerrilla warfare over the next several months against the Greek Empire, eventually winning the battle, rededicating the temple. And that's when you get the Hanukkah story of the lights and the oil and everything like that. And so Hanukkah historically celebrates a military victory by Jewish ragtag group of rebels against the Greeks. It is probably the most Israel-centric holiday. It is probably the most militant holiday that Jews have. This is why, as just an aside, it's always ironic when, far left-wingers such as, AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar always, tweet their, happy Hanukkah, because Hanukkah is probably the most Zionist holiday that we have. And this is precisely how modern day Israelis remember Hanukkah, in terms of the military and in terms of the victory and Jewish strength. Of course, Hanukkah in America has nothing to do with Hanukkah of the past. And this is not to moralize it either way. I'm not saying that the contemporary Jewish practice of Hanukkah in America is bad, but let's just imagine you pop into a time machine 500 years ago and go to any Jewish community celebrating Hanukkah. They wouldn't have heard of latkes. They wouldn't have heard of dreidels. They would have no idea what you meant with Hanukkah presents. And if you tried to universalize Hanukkah as, it's about the beauty of spreading lights and about peace and love, they would have had no idea what you're talking about. You probably would have been laughed out of the room, not to mention that Hanukkah historically is a very, very minor Jewish holiday. Hanukkah is not even one of the top 10 Jewish holidays. There's actually a great comedic bit by Ari Shafir, who's a Jewish comedian that has a whole bit about Hanukkah where he says, Hanukkah is not even one of our top 12 holidays, that it's basically, the Jewish equivalent of Arbor Day in terms of Jewish history. And there's no real set of Jewish laws talking about Hanukkah. The chief example that people give is the Mishnah, the first set of rabbinic law written in about the 2nd century CE, doesn't dedicate any space to Hanukkah, right? Hanukkah seems to be a Jewish afterthought. And so what happened? How did Hanukkah end up being the most widely celebrated holiday in America? Some of this, I'm guessing, you can probably guess, where the American Jewish experience has been fundamentally different than Jewish experiences in Europe and across the world. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But one of the biggest problems for Jews in America in terms of Jewish leadership was assimilation, right? Unlike Europe and unlike other places that Jews lived throughout history, there was no ability to assimilate because Jews were fundamentally different, right? In the Islamic world, Jews were treated as dhimmis and grave second-class citizens, and Jews were unable to coexist within their Muslim brethren in terms of equals. In Europe, it was actually worse, with Jews being condemned to either ghettos, or if we're talking about Eastern Europe, the Pale of Settlements, or having to wear stars saying they were Jewish, right? Assimilation in, say, the 1700s in Europe would have been very hard. Obviously, post-emancipation, it might have gotten a little bit easier, but I don't want to complicate things. But in America, that started off with this idea of liberalism, right? We treat people as individuals, not as a part of the group. And America, this great melting pot, the great place of Jewish assimilation. Many European rabbis actually in the 1800s forbade people to go and live in America because they called America the Treifa Medina, right? The non-kosher country, because the classic story is that European Jews would move to America, and within 1 or 2 generations, they would end up marrying non-Jews, they would assimilate, they would stop doing Jewish practices, and nothing was more quintessential of this shift than Christmas, right? Christmas, what an incredible day, right? There's lights everywhere, it's so festive, there's snow, there's all this great music. By the way, a lot of the great music was actually written by Jews, but that is a completely side point. But Christmas is such a beautiful, such a nice, universalistic, quintessential American holiday. And in the mid-19th century, we're talking about, 1840s, 1850s. This is right after a wave of a lot of immigration from Germany. So there was a major wave in 1840s of German Jews to America. And a lot of Reform rabbis started to look around and realize that young Jews were starting to celebrate Christmas en masse. And so, of course, they realized that a lot of young Jews, if it was between Christmas or nothing, they'd probably celebrate Christmas. So in response, they started rebranding Hanukkah as a communal winter holiday that was based around community and the synagogue, instead of the home-based holiday that had once been in Europe. And what I mean by that is the idea of even Hanukkah parties or public Hanukkah gatherings or anything other than you just lighting candles at home is all a recent phenomenon. The only laws and the only true practice of Hanukkah that would have probably existed 300-400 years ago is your family, the same way people light Shabbat candles every week before Shabbat, right? It's very private. You do it at home. You do it at sunset time or right before sunset, right? Hanukkah celebration would have been the same way. There would have been no such thing as, Hanukkah parties and the like. So these Reform rabbis in the 1840s, 1850s started rebranding Hanukkah as almost the Jewish Christmas, right? Specifically competing with Christmas in terms of the winter holidays. And of course, at this point, it was only a matter of time before the consumerist markets caught on. And so now, of course, you can imagine, America, very big on consumerism. All of a sudden, markets began advertising and marketing the idea of Hanukkah presents, right? What's a Hanukkah present if not just a Jewish version of Christmas presents, right? This idea of 8 nights, you get to buy 8 sets of presents. And everything else we know about Hanukkah, the idea of, nice universalistic lights, right? Obviously mirroring Christmas lights, public celebrations, mirroring Christmas public celebrations. And of course, this is a distinct phenomenon that only could have existed in America, because if we go back in time, Christmas for European Jews was actually a day of absolute terror. And what I mean by that is in the Middle Ages, even until the late 1800s in Europe, Christmas was a day where anti-Semitism would proliferate for Jews within Europe, right? One, obviously, the entire idea of Christmas centering around Jesus, right? This was a day where the Jews were looked to with increased scrutiny for quote unquote, killing Jesus. Of course, this is not historically true, but Jews have been blamed for killing Jesus over the last 2,000 years. And so it was specifically Christmas in Europe when many European leaders would dafka or specifically issue new anti-Semitic ordinances and laws specifically on Christmas, because they knew that most people would be more in touch with Christianity, more people would be more in tune with the community spirit. And so for Jews in Eastern Europe, and also even in Western Europe throughout history, Christmas was specifically a day where you stayed home, you didn't go outside, you locked your doors. This is so much true that even in a lot of Hasidic communities today in 2024, Christmas night is a day called Nittelnacht, and Nittelnacht is specifically the only night of the year where rabbis say, do not go to synagogue, do not go to the Beit Midrash, stay at home, lock your doors. And there's all sorts of fascinating Hasidic customs, such as, playing chess and checkers on Christmas night to specifically assure that people are not going outside. In the year 1881, actually, which is a fascinating and probably one of the most important years in Jewish history, I'll explain why, in Warsaw, there was a massive set of pogroms that erupted around Christmas time that spent, 2 or 3 days of Jewish shops getting burned and looted right and left. 1881 is, of course, the crucial year that Eastern European Jews started moving to America. Just the 2-second spark notes on American Jewish history from 1881 till 1924 was 2 million or 2.5 million Jews from Eastern Europe moving to America. The vast majority of American Jews today can trace in some way back to this massive waves of migration. Of course, in 1924, America became much more strict in terms of its border law. This is, of course, exactly 100 years ago. There's a lot to say about the year 1924 in terms of American Jewish history. But at the year when pogroms and anti-Semitic riots were beginning, specifically centered around Christmas for Jews in Eastern Europe, this is when the majority of Jews were migrating to America and establishing Hanukkah as we are both American, right? We are able to compete with Christmas in terms of the public sphere. And so in terms of moralizing this, right, it's very easy for some people to sit on their high horse and say, well, the American celebration of Hanukkah is really just a farce and a recent thing. But also, in some sense, it's sort of a quintessential American day where Hanukkah in America shows that Jews are actually invited into the mainstream, into the public sphere, into the sort of dominant, liberal, capitalistic, and I say these things all without giving moral claims to it, but just descriptive, right? Jews are just treated equally in the eyes of liberalism and in the eyes of capitalism, which is why these things in general are seen as good by the vast majority of Jews. So much so that even today, starting in the 1970s, of course, now everybody takes this for granted, but the idea of public menorah lightings was started by the Chabad movement in the 1970s. This is something that would have been fundamentally unrecognizable and impossible within Jews living in the Arab world and also in Christian-controlled Europe. The idea that Jews are going to be able to go into the public sphere and publicly celebrate their religion. So this Hanukkah, while we, engage in all of what we think to be the historic Hanukkah, of course, the dreidel only existing for about 200 years. It was some knockoff of some German game, chocolate gelt, Hanukkah gelt was actually based on real coins of charity that parents would give their kids to give their rabbis around the wintertime. This became, repackaged as chocolate. And even latkes, this quintessential Hanukkah food is actually only about 150 to 200 years old, of Eastern European, dinner staple, right? Again, potatoes were the staple food for many in Eastern Europe. But all this is to say, if you took a time machine 500 years ago and thought you knew what Hanukkah was, you'd probably be a little bit confused and a little bit shocked as you walked into any Jewish community. But the way that we celebrate Hanukkah in America today, yes, it is based off of Christmas, but not based off of Christmas in terms of a negative way, but in terms of the blessing, really, for American Jewish history of what America has been as a beacon of fundamental safety and fundamental equality for Jews really throughout our history here. So happy Hanukkah. And if you also celebrate Christmas, Merry Christmas.